Hey there folks, Wrel here. We're going to be talking about Peril in Pinebrook today, which is a Dungeons & Dragons adventure module that was recently released, except we're going to address it from a design perspective, because there's a lot of cool stuff. I'm not going to talk much about the adventure at all. The PDF will be in the background, so potential spoilers, but it's a cute adventure. Pacing is good. The encounters and characters you interact with are good. Everything is clean, straightforward, and it gets players excited to play again, which is probably the most important part. So we're going to talk about the design decisions that make the module good before you even introduce your character. On November 20, the Wizards D&D Twitter released a short adventure module that you can download for free. They didn't route you to an external site. They didn't try to capture your emails. You just click on the link and then it's there. That's the first bit that caught my interest because the goal here is very obviously, right from the moment that you find out about it, that you find out that it's even a module that exists, is that it's not meant to pull you in as a consumer. It's meant to pull you into the hobby. And that clarity of who they're designing for seems to drive a lot of the design decisions that I'll talk about in this video. So right from the get-go, module says that it's designed for younger players, but can be enjoyed by players of all ages. And I'm almost disappointed that they call out younger players here, because regardless of how old you are, it's a really good starting point for anybody who's new to the game, whether you're a player or a GM. That said, as an experienced player, this module is very clearly not designed for me, but that's part of the reason why I was excited by some of the design decisions further in. They talk through what a D20 roll is for, how to attack, what to do with it, the advantage, disadvantage, other concepts core to D&D, or specifically the module. Then it goes on to give the DM guidance on how to run a game. And just as important, it has an entire section with read aloud blocks of text that the DM can use to explain the game mechanics to other players. And that's freaking awesome. For example, it says, explain how D20 rolls work with the following example. The character, Nura Eldenfield, has a short bow attack that says +5 to hit. When Nura attacks with the short bow, the player rolls a d20, then adds 5 to the number roll to the die, blah, 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 blah. Using part of the adventure module to teach a GM how to teach the party is a great use of space. By contrast, Dragons of Stormwreck Isle has a free prelude that you can download. It's called Intro to Stormwreck Isle, and it does not do this. It sets the scene. It gives you one read aloud paragraph that tells you almost nothing useful, and then you jump into your first encounter. Despite Dragons of Stormwreck Isle being heralded as a great introduction to D&D, and it is, it pales in comparison to the groundwork that Perils in Pinebrook lays out. The other big note about Perils in Pinebrook is that given that it's geared toward fresh, new, babyface players, the rules are way stripped back. As an experienced player, it was interesting to see what they chose to leave out, what they chose to leave in, because it's always easy to write more and say, hey, to figure it out, but it's incredibly difficult to carve away what does not serve your needs, especially if you do not have a clear vision or understanding of who you're serving. Peril in Pinebrook comes with 4 pre-made characters. Those characters have attacks, they have equipment that's thematic to the class or relevant to the module, they have a special ability, which is basically a level 1 class feature, but is explained in a way that tells you what it actually does without needing to know the rules of the game. We'll cover this more in a bit. It has your armor class, has some relevant skills, your class, species, and a name that you can replace with a nickname of your own. What it doesn't have are any ability scores. It doesn't have initiative. In fact, you take turns by going around the table. It's a good way to do it. It doesn't have movement speed. Your attacks are predefined, and they tell you that they either do ranged or melee damage instead of having granular damage types. And get this, in the instructions, it explicitly mentions that you need a d20 and a d6 to play. That's it. The reason you can get away with this is that every character is using a d6 weapon. Rogue gets a short sword, clerics get a mace, the fighter gets a hand axe, and the wizard gets a quarterstaff. It doesn't go into the different traits of each weapon. It just tells you what to roll for damage and what to add to it. For the mage, there's also a firebolt cantrip, but the firebolt, instead of dealing a d10 of damage, just deals a flat 7 damage. This still gets the flavor of the class across, without straying from those two necessary dice. And it's also a message to the player to say, hey, use this instead of trying to hit them with your quarterstaff because the number's higher. This, in theory, lowers the barrier to entry. While a d20 would be rare in any tabletop game that isn't exclusively a d20 system, if you have a DM who is trying to learn the game, chances are they already have one. On top of that, you aren't fussing over a bunch of different dice. You can use one that's core to D&D as a system, and one that is very familiar to people who have played more traditional games at the table. At the bottom of the sheet, every class gets one special ability. These are warped a little bit from what you'd actually get from a level 1 character, but is tailored well to the module. For example, the rogue has an ability that says, when you take your first turn in combat, you get to roll 2d6 damage instead of the 1d6. It represents the theme of the rogue without actually having to teach the GM or the players the rules for hiding, which I can't even remember them myself half the time. They're also smart about how they want time to be structured in this module. In the cleric's ability, it says, twice during this adventure, you can cast a spell called Cure Wounds on yourself or another creature. If they would have said, twice before a long rest, people would either wonder what a long rest is or whether or not they could take one, which would slow the game down and isn't in the spirit of the module. Instead, it keeps the time abstract to this adventure, which is something small that I appreciate. It goes on to say that you can cast this spell instead of one of your regular attacks, or after combat ends. This little line smartly conveys the action economy of the game without having to teach players what it actually means. While there is a mention of an action with a capital A in the document, it's more often used as a term to loosely describe the one important thing that the player wants to do. So the biggest question I had when playing through this module, and if you remember, it's not for a player like me, but my biggest question was, what's the next logical step for players who want to learn more about actual D&D? Actual D&D in finger quotes. I was wondering, given how much of the technical rules have been kind of removed from the experience, would the game that we play next be too far removed from what they just played? So I was one of 4 players. The DM was fairly new, have DM'd some things in the past, but not all that much. 2 of the players were totally new to D&D, and one of the other players had played 1st edition so long ago that it's barely relevant. They knew that they were playing a slimmed down version of the game, and in fact, we'd added some rules to the experience as we played through, just to let people roll more dice. So for example, everybody rolled a flat initiative instead of going around the table. We had the wizard roll a d10 for a firebolt instead of using the flat value. But aside from that, played it pretty straight. Now, there's also opportunity attacks too. We talked about that a little bit. But again, module's not for me. We just happen to know the rules, and these are adults that we were playing with. So the question that I had asked was along the lines of, how difficult was it for you to get your bearings, and did anything trip you up? Around the table, everybody thought that they can pretty easily wrap their head around the rules and the gameplay as soon as they got into the flow of things. I think people had trouble remembering to read their special abilities, but frankly, even experienced players do that all the time. At the end of the game, everybody was excited to make actual characters, and they saw what real character sheets look like. In fact, one of the other players had printed them off and brought them. We had talked about creating characters before the session, and I'm glad we didn't. I'm glad we played with the pre-gens. We talked about D&D Beyond as well, which is a really useful resource for walking you through the process, and they were stoked to get started. With that being said, main takeaways that I pull are threefold. Firstly, if you're working on a TTRPG, or trying to introduce players to an existing one, paring down the rules is okay. You do not need to learn the entire game before you start playing the game. Instead, the first experience you provide to players should be to make them feel comfortable. The last thing that you want is for a player to feel defeated, frustrated, or confused. Hopefully, if you can make them feel comfortable, that'll translate into excitement, and then they'll explore the game further on their own. Secondly, create a separate beginning adventure. I think there's value in having a totally separate product, packet, whatever, that's meant as a more lightweight introduction, provided you're developing something that has a heavier rules system to it. Many of the more weighty games have quick start guides, but fewer have spin-off products that reduce the investment a potential player needs before they get into the game. Thirdly, align the themes of the adventure with the mechanics that you'd like to teach the players. I say that this is an obvious one, but after hearing how the preview of Black Flag went down at Gen Con, maybe it's not so obvious. Perils in Pinebrook ties strongly to dragons, where you might find one, what they would do, how you interact with them, with dragons obviously being a very prominent piece of the D&D universe. In addition, it's teaching you about combat and general flow for puzzle solving, introducing you to roleplay elements and table dynamics, etc., etc. These are the things that you will interact with most often. It doesn't force you to inventory manage. It doesn't force you to deal with subsystems or access obscure rules. I think that these 3 takeaways, despite it, again, not being an adventure for me, is still worthwhile to think about. Very smartly designed. I'm super happy to have run it, and I had a blast. If this video has been interesting, helpful, or entertaining, please feel free to like, subscribe, tell your friends about the channel. And if you're interested in TTRPG design or would like to follow the development of Distal, which is the one that I'm currently working on, feel free to join us at playthisrpg.com. Thanks very much, folks. Wrel signing off.